Good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of the Florida IPDA and the Florida Department of Education, we welcome you to Webinar Wednesdays. I'm June Rawl, the Director of Florida IPDA. Today, Bonnie Gooden and Susan Pittman are going to take you through the steps for helping your students more effectively write constructive responses. I know that you'll enjoy all of the many resources provided that will assist your students in going from zeros to twos. Bonnie and Susan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, June. We're really glad to be with everyone this afternoon. And Susan, you know, as we've been going all over the U.S., it seems like the one thing we keep hearing is, how in the world do I assist my students in getting more than that scorable 0 on the constructed response? And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into strategies that will help our students improve their writing skills so that they can create effective arguments and counter-arguments, that they can develop those ideas and organizational structure that they need, and of course that they revise and edit. So before we get started, let's look a little bit at what GDTS is seeing in constructed response.
Yeah, and Bonnie, one of the things I'd like to talk about a little bit with this as we go through is that, you know, the GD testing service has been doing quite a bit of analysis on the constructed responses that are out there. And what we know and what teachers have been saying to us is that most students, they're earning few, if any, points. That basically what they're doing is they're summarizing. So they're just kind of regurgitating again what they just read from the stimulus text itself. They're not analyzing, they're not evaluating. And this is a real big one because it makes such a difference in those score points. They're not explaining anything. They may give some evidence, but then they don't connect it back to show why it's important for the claim itself. And last but not least, they're not writing enough what we call original material. In other words, what they're doing is they're lifting a lot of text from the stimulus, and as a result of that, there's not enough there for the automated scoring engine to actually score it for grammar and sentence structure. So it comes down really to two items. They're not writing enough, and they're not answering the question. And that's such a huge issue for our students because we do know that there is a lot at stake here when we look in terms of the percentages of this test that really fall into extended response or short answer. The thing that I think, you know, Bonnie, you and I have talked about it quite a bit is the fact that what we see is students who are not earning any points is basically, it's as if they were skipping questions because in reasoning through language arts, the extended response is about 20% of the test. Now, can you pass the test without writing anything? Yes, you can. However, the probability of that is not that great because it's really worth 12 points. And so our students have to be cognizant of the fact that, you know, any point helps because for every point they earn, that's multiplied by 2 because it's a weighting factor. So we want to make sure students are getting as many points as possible. When it comes to the extended response in social studies, they got 25 minutes to do this, and you know, one of the big questions that's been coming up, and I know it's one that GD Testing Service has been dealing with quite a bit recently, is that the RLA with 45 minutes and the social studies with 25, the question is coming back, is that enough time for students to actually do what they're supposed to do? And the reality is that it's more than enough time, and sadly, what students are doing is they're not taking all of that time itself. So we have to really start looking at how do we work with constructed response? How do we make sure that students are doing the best that they can do? Because, you know, the skills that are there for the writing, those are skills that it doesn't matter if a student's not going to college. If they're going into the workplace, chances are real good they're going to have to use those same skills in the workplace. So we have to get students past the idea that maybe this is just for somebody else, but really I don't need those writing skills. But I think as we go through today, we can actually help a little bit with that, because maybe we can lay some of the myths to rest, and maybe we can show people how it can be easy to work with effective argumentative writing. So Bonnie, talk to us a little bit about what that is. What is argumentative writing?
As we look at what argumentative writing is, I just want to let everyone know that there is a guide for this particular webinar. So all of the information that we're providing to you, as well as the templates for the different graphic organizers that we use, you have in a document. And that to me makes things so much easier as we talk about argumentative writing. But what is it? Is it something new? Well, actually, it isn't anything new. It's the type of writing that each of us uses on a daily basis. In fact, if any of you were in, once upon a time, a debate class, you would have used argumentative types of speech. And one of the gentlemen who was really the guru of argumentative speech patterns in debate was a gentleman by the name of Toulmin. And Toulmin's concept for debate is exactly the same concept that we need to be using in argumentative writing. He said to argue anything, first of all, you need to set your claim. What are you trying to prove? And you need to support that claim with evidence, valid evidence. And then you need to explain how that evidence supports the claim, often called a warrant or a bridge, back those supports, back that warrant, and finally get those qualifications and rebuttals, because we know that anytime someone makes a claim, there's always a counterclaim. One of those things where if I say one thing, quite honestly, Susan may say, well, that sounds good, but, and I come back and say, however. That really is argumentative writing. So, how do we deal in implementing argumentative writing in the classroom? Bottom line is we have to teach one step at a time. This is not a process that you can just teach in one afternoon and expect students to get it. Instead, you need to take very much a step-by-step approach, and some of those steps are going to take you some time. So as we talk about that step-by-step approach, please, if you've got questions or if you have comments, just log them into that question section as we go forward. So we're going to talk about really 6 steps. 6 steps that you can implement in your classroom. And those steps are that we need to teach students how to closely read or unpack prompts. We need to teach them how to analyze and evaluate so they can develop their claim. We need to teach students how to find the evidence, how to find valid, effective evidence. And then, of course, to identify that counterclaim and rebuttal. But it's not done yet. They then have to be able to draft their writing sample and, of course, revise and edit it before publishing. So, Susan, let's take a look at that first step.
Okay, so I think when it all starts, it comes back to the fact of, do I know what the question really wants me to do? And that's where students are having difficulty because they're not doing something that is really basic, and that's called unpacking the prompt. Now, some of you have been with Bonnie and I before in different workshops, and you may have heard us talk about and laugh about the do what process. But I still think that that process is one that makes a huge difference for our students who are out there because it gives them a focus, a focal point as they're reading. Because basically what they're doing is they're looking for those action verbs. In other words, what am I going to do? And then that explanation of what that action will be. So if we take a look at our good old daylight savings time prompt, what we see is as we look at the prompt, we have a lead in, and then beyond that, it starts out with in your response. And basically from there, what our students can do is just click through the different verbs to determine what needs to be done in their response. So our first verb that we have is analyze, and we say, okay, what are we going to analyze? And it's both positions presented in the article. Now, here comes another verb, determine. And what are we determining? Well, we've got to decide which one is best supported. Not the one that we like the best in terms of our own personal feelings, but what's best supported, because we're going to have to use something, and that something is relevant evidence from the passage itself. So it's not good enough if I just talk about how I don't like daylight savings time. I have to go through and make my argument based on the evidence in the passage itself. And from there, I'm actually going to use that evidence to support my response itself. Now, what am I going to have to do at that point? Well, I'm going to have to type. And that typing means that I've got to keyboard in, so I've got to think about my time frame as I'm going through and doing my planning and all of those types of things, because what does this NRLA take? Well, it takes about 45 minutes to do this. So I need to have in my mind kind of where I want to go and how I'm going to get there and how I allocate my time as I go through. So it's a simple little process and something you could practice with any number of different things. The nice thing, Bonnie, I think about the prompts that we have now is they're so easy to imitate. You can take an article and develop your own prompt, so students actually have some practice with this process.
You know, Susan, as I look at this one of the questions that students often ask is, okay, I've read the prompt. Let me ask, is there a better side? If I take a pro side or take the con side, will I get more points? And the answer is no. It does not matter which position they take as long as they use specific evidence to support it. And we have a couple questions. For those of you who are wondering whether you're going to get a copy of this presentation, yes, both this presentation and the guide that goes along with today's webinar have been posted on the Florida IPDay website. And what will also be posted will be the audio of the webinar. So, you know, the next step after they know what they're supposed to be doing is to really take that close read of the article. Because close reading, whether it's the constructed response or whether it's other types of test questions, is absolutely essential. So as you work with close reading with your students, make sure that they can answer questions after they've read. Can they identify the different arguments that the author makes? Can they determine the position that an author takes? Is that author for or against? Because we know sometimes that they may have a couple excerpts to read. And if they don't have a couple, we know that they will at least have two sides to an argument in one article. Do they know or can they identify one point, one piece of evidence that supports the author's argument? And what is that evidence the author gives? We also want to make sure that we know, or our students know, what the point of view of the author is, and one point that refutes the author's point of view. This is one of those things before students ever get started writing. We need to know, can they analyze and evaluate the text so that they can answer these basic questions? And I'd want to do that with my students repeatedly. So I'd be very comfortable that once they start going those next steps, they know where they need to head.
And Bonnie, we've had a question come in from Dion, which says, your comment, students do not produce enough original content. How much is enough? And I think it's an excellent question because we get this so many different times. But when it comes down to looking at, as Bonnie said, what evidence does the author give to support this point, that the student is going to want to use a couple of pieces of the evidence that's there. Now, how they connect that, a student might use 2 or 3 pieces from the article itself, but it's going to be something where the student has to write original content. And when we say that, we mean that rather than quote from the text itself, they need to write their explanation. They need to paraphrase some of the information that's there. That's really what comes back to original content, is the fact that they are not copying it from someone else or from the author of whatever the stimulus material was. But one thing in talking with the GED testing service is that you really want students in this particular type of writing to take 2 or 3 good pieces of evidence and work with them. They don't have a set amount, so if you do 2 and that they're not looking just for 3, unless they say they have a certain amount that they want. So I hope, Dion, that helps in answering your question.
Susan, let me just add one other thing. It's not just about how many pieces of evidence. If students are writing and they are basically using the words of the text to provide that evidence and not connecting it with their own words, there again, they're not going to have enough original text. And we see a lot of that in the lower scored writing samples that GED Testing Service has provided us. What we see is what we term that word summarize, and we'll talk more about that later. But there again, if all I'm doing is taking the words of the text and somewhat paraphrasing them, but really not adding those connection pieces, I'm not going to get a good score. So let's talk a little bit about what analysis and evaluation is, because we all know that that's another issue in getting those top scores on trait 1. Because an analysis or evaluation, it's not a summary. I do not say, there's many reasons that daylight savings time is good, and all I do is talk about what the article has said. Have I analyzed or taken apart the argument? Or have I evaluated how credible that argument is? Is the research relevant? Is the research accurate? Is the research recent enough? Those are things that articles don't tell me specifically. I have to dig deeper and I have to recognize that information. Again, if I'm analyzing, I have to look deeper and determine, is the evidence that I'm providing sufficient and is it accurate? We oftentimes see in education there may have been a research study done, but it was only done on 10 people. Is that evidence sufficient to prove some side? And no, it's not. So when we analyze and when we teach analyzing to our students, we need to have them examine the form, the content of the organization of what they are reading, and examine the author's purpose. Why is the author writing it? What's the author's point of view? And look at that author's claim and the reasons for the claim and determine then, is that evidence sufficient, or are there logical fallacies or errors in reasoning? So I take things apart when I analyze. When I teach students to evaluate, it's looking holistically at what they've read and determine or evaluate, is there a good purpose of the argument? Is it a valid argument? And when I look at the claim of that author, how is it expressed and is there reliable evidence that supports it? As Susan and I, again, have read through the writings that students have done for GED Testing Service in their guide, what we see a lot of is that introduction really doesn't analyze or evaluate, but rather it summarizes what the article has said. So that's a little different than what we've been teaching, and that really has caused a problem for our students. How do we really teach analyzing and evaluation? Again, through close reading, through asking those higher order questions, but sometimes it's fun in the classroom just setting up some type of a stance on an issue that's important and having students, quote, argue, present that stance and argue their reasons for supporting it. And there again, it provides that back and forth between one side or the other. Students get the idea that arguing isn't a win-win, but rather, can you persuade someone to your side? And you know, Susan, we've had teachers who have said they've tried this, and sometimes we get some feedback. There have been a few heated discussions, especially when sometimes they talk about some of those social studies content articles.
Well, that's true, but I will say, and just share this for you from Sandra James, is the fact that right now she's using a Newsella article on diet sodas, and she said it was a great article to use for this. In fact, she's using it right now.
Okay, that's while both you and I are probably drinking a diet soda right now,
Absolutely.
Correct?
Absolutely. And you know, there's one other question that just popped in, and I think we go ahead and address it at this point, because you mentioned about looking at samples of writing. And so from Nancy Ober, we have a question that says, could we see samples of writing that get no points, 1 point, 2 points? And the answer to that is yes, you can. In fact, if you go out to the GD Testing Service website, one of the most useful tools that you will find out there, actually there are multiple ones, but something that, especially if you're looking at RLA right now, is that there is a GED social Reasoning Through Language Arts Extended Response Resource Guide, and that guide has samples of writing. It's wonderful. In fact, that is exactly what Bonnie and I used as we were really working with these different materials, because you know, it's one thing to kind of hear a description as Bonnie's talking or I'm talking, but the other part is what does it look like? What does it really look like? And so that's a great resource.
And Nancy, we will have that up on one of our last slides. So again, we will revisit where in the world do you find that? So, how do you help students analyze and evaluate? Susan and I are providing you with a few graphic organizers for each step, and you have all of those in your guide, but things where students have to identify pros and cons, or V-charts. What are the areas of position 1 and position 2, and how would they develop a claim? Those are all first steps. And you know, if I would take that article on diet soda, the pros and cons, it would be real easy to help students analyze, was there better research on the pro side or on the con side? Was the evidence accurate? And using one of these types of graphic organizers, they would already start that analyzation and evaluation process. And that's where we need to spend time. Is it all about writing? Absolutely not. It's about those close reading skills and then going the next step. So, what is the next step? It's developing the claim. And Susan, what actually is a claim?
Well, you know, we can sometimes call it a stance, a claim, maybe we even call it a thesis statement, depending on where we are. But really what it's doing is it's saying, this is what's being argued, and this is the point that's being made. You know, the thing about it is that anytime a student makes a claim, there's kind of 3 little questions that have to go along with it. And that first one is it debatable? Well, if we were to take daylight savings time as our example, sure, we could debate that the pro side has more research versus and much more evidence than the other. Or do we have something that's just too broad to write about? Like, you know, we want to narrow in our focus on this. And this one, it can easily be narrowed down to the basics because we're talking about one position or another. And then last but not least, and this is something students have to ask themselves, is the evidence going to support that claim? Do I have evidence in that passage? And that really comes back, Bonnie, to what you were talking about earlier about the fact that students have to do the reading, the close reading of that material to make sure they've got everything lined up the way that they need it so that, yeah, they can take a claim and then they can support it. But, you know, students, many of our students, this is kind of a different way of writing. So there's some things that you can use. And in your resource guide, you're going to find some writing frames that will help students go through and determine what their claim is. Now, what we ideally want students to do is use these just for the short term and then have them begin to develop their own claims as they're moving through without having to rely on a frame in order to put that in. But this is a great way to get students started in the process and how a claim really could be laid out, what it looks like as they're working through. So if we go to that next slide, what you're going to see is there's a sample claim there for you. And this one in daylight savings, dealing with the daylight savings time, says in the argument for daylight savings time, the pro daylight savings position is better supported. And look at what they did. They went on to explain why. Because the research is more timely and reliable. If they just go through and they stop at that, is better supported, that's not really giving them an adequate claim itself, because I need to know why and what you're going to prove as you move through the rest of the document itself. So that makes a huge difference as we're going through, because now I, as the reader, will actually be going back and looking for some of those things. Okay, you said it was more timely and reliable. I'm going to look for evidence that you connected to those two ideas.
And Susan, I think that bears repeating, and that is we see a lot of claims being written that they would stop right after that word supported. And you're so correct, it doesn't really evaluate. It just says, okay, one side is better than the other. I want to know why. And if I don't have that why part of it, then I've not argued or evaluated. And we do have a question, and we're going to answer part of it now, but we're going to leave part of it to go. And that is the fact that as an instructor, sometimes we do read things that our students write and we think they've nailed it. And then when they get into the tests, they come back with scorable zeros, even on that trait 3. And when we get into revision and editing in just a moment, we're really going to talk about and reiterate why are they getting a scorable 0 on trait 3, which is grammar and use of sentence structure. But I really believe that part of the reason that they're getting a scorable 0 on trait 1 is first and foremost, they're not truly setting an arguable claim that says it's supported by, the evidence. Because nowhere in this article will students ever see the words, the research is more timely and more reliable. They have evaluated that information to come up with that second part of the claim. So as you look at any type of frame, writing frame, make sure that not only do they put the claim in, but that claim includes because of this or because of that. So, Susan, that's a claim.
Well, but if you're going to have a claim, then you have to have something else. And that something else is evidence. And that evidence has to support that claim. It can't be opinion, because we're not asking how you as the student feels or thinks, but rather it's information that came from the passage, and it could be facts or statistics, it could be expert opinion or examples. Those are the kinds of things that the student is going to want to pull as they're going through, because they need to pull that evidence that's going to support that claim that they've made. Now, just like with having writing frames, here's some writing frames for incorporating evidence. And this again is something you can start with students, but it's certainly not something that you're going to want them to do on an ongoing basis. Eventually, the little birdies have to start to fly on their own, and that means that they've got to come back and start creating those things as a part of this process itself.
And Susan, these are great when we get back writing from students and all we see is the author said, the author said, the author said, which does not create very effective writing. So instead of us as instructors going in and saying, if you said it it this way, you said it that way, the frames provide them with different ways to develop those ideas, develop that evidence in a more effective style.
And I'm going to go and answer a question real quick because I think a part of this is coming back in here too. You and I referred to the resource guide for the extended response examples, and the comment came in that those examples are only scored on one trait. If you have an older extended response resource guide, it was only scored on one trait, but now the newer edition shows the score for the other two traits, so you can see what that got overall. The only thing that now is missing, and this is something that will be added in the future, is that they do not have annotations for the other two traits, but they do have scores. So now, if you have an old book, you may want to ditch that one and get the newer version, which is online at this point in time, and you'll see those scores. Because I'm like a lot of other people, Bonnie, I think that makes a difference as we're going through to really kind of understand as we're working with it.
Totally agreed.
So let's, you know what, I mean, it comes back to the fact that, you know, we do have to make sure the evidence connects. And that's one of those things, you know, we call the warrant, or we call it a bridge, whichever one. It doesn't matter. You can use either one, which explains, because we can't have students making lists. And that's kind of what's happening in trait 1 with a number of the ones that are getting a scorable 0, is they're not putting bullets in there, don't think that, but the way it reads, you know, when you read something and it looks like a list, that's what's happening for a lot of students as they're putting any evidence in. They're not going back and showing how those pieces connect. And I think, Bonnie, you have a really great little graphic on the next slide that really comes through and shows how all these pieces actually connect. And this is kind of the thinking process that students need to go through as they're working on this. They've got their claim. Now, find a direct quote that supports that claim. We're not going to use it in the final analysis, but find that direct quote and then come back and paraphrase. Can the student rewrite that so that they're not just using text straight from the passage? And also the next piece, which is the essential piece. Can they show, if we think back to that claim we had about it being more timely and thorough, or whatever the wording was at that point, does it connect back to what we said in the claim? Those are the things that we have to do. And I think, Bonnie, you even have one in here that shows people kind of a way of taking a look at it. And, you know, we're going to go through in just a little bit and we'll take a look at the guide. But at the same time, know that each of these items are also included in the guide, which can be helpful after you get off of this webinar and you're trying to think, okay, now what was it they said about this? But just take a look across the board here with going from the claim, moving to the direct quote, rewriting it, paraphrasing what was there, and then making that explanation. It's higher order writing. However, it's writing that students need for post-secondary, whether that's technical training or going on for a 2-year degree. I mean, we're not looking at everybody going to get a bachelor's degree, but also for students who are going into the workplace. Someone who has those kinds of skills is going to be a valued employee.
So let's take a look at what this actually looks like in student writing. And again, we took this directly out of one of the sample writings that GED Testing Service has in this guide. And just know that all of those writings were done by adult students in the 45-minute time period. And this is what it would look like in one of these constructed responses. It says the second position is much better supported, especially compared to the somewhat lacking arguments of the previous position. The writer's information is precise, and he seems to use more studies than the first author. This would be an example of authentic text. None of these words are in the writing sample. The student had to evaluate what he or she read and then connect it back to the claim, which said the reason one side was better than the other was that the studies were more precise and more useful or valid. So this is a connection piece. This is also an example of authentic text. Nothing there that directly is lifted from the words of the article. Okay, so we have the close reading and unpacking the prompt. We've set our claim. We've supported and connected that claim with evidence. But you know, in all good argumentative writing, there's always some other side. And so that's the counterclaim, and then coming across with a rebuttal. So I set the claim that the prose side is won because the evidence is more specific, newer, more valid. The counterclaim is going to disagree with that claim, and it's going to be reasonable because we all know that there's two sides. So in the counterclaim, a student needs to set that counterclaim with some piece of evidence that supports it, and then come back with his or her rebuttal of why the counterclaim is wrong or not as good, and how they disagree with it. So what do they need to do? They need to say why the counterclaim is wrong, what's the evidence as to why that counterclaim is wrong or less effective, and many times that rebuttal starts with words like however, nevertheless, although. Those are the types of words. So let's again go to a writing sample and see what happens here. The writer brings up expenses, safety, and crime rates, all of which are supposedly improved through the use of DST. That's my counterclaim. However, the evidence he uses to support this claim seems general and outdated. That's my rebuttal. And when you look at that, you see the words of the counterclaim and you see the words of the rebuttal. And one of the things that works real well with students is to let them identify counterclaims and rebuttals while they read different types of excerpts. Can they identify the words of counterclaims, such as, one might object that, or according to the research, although there is evidence to support, the other side states that. And all good rebuttals generally start with words such as, nevertheless, but, however, in contrast, or on the other hand. These are the words, again, that students need to first identify in reading samples and then be able to use them as they write. And those really are the basic segments of argumentative writing. But we know there's more. Once they've developed this information, either through a graphic organizer, hopefully that's what they're using, or notes, it is finally time to look at what's the process or what is the format I should use. Susan, what type of format are we using now? Is it back to that good old 5-paragraph essay structure, or do I need a separate paragraph for all of these different parts?
Oh, thank goodness, no, I don't have to go back to the 5-paragraph essay. But I do have to look at it from the way that many of us learned, and I know, yes, Bonnie and I are baby boomers, so it was back in the dark ages. But what we do have to do is have students look at having 3 distinct parts. And I say parts, I'm not saying paragraphs, but 3 distinct parts to their writing. The first one is a beginning or introduction, and that's where their claim is going to go. And usually that claim ends up being that last sentence of that first paragraph, because there's usually a little bit of a lead in, and then you see that. In the body or the middle, you may have a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, 3 paragraphs. It all depends on the ideas that you're using, the evidence that's going in, how you're going to structure that. And then last but not least, you have an ending, which really summarizes the position that you've taken, and then comes back in and kind of restates the thesis statement. It's not a direct quote back to the thesis statement, but sums it up because you're trying to bring in that conclusion. So what the conversations that we have heard so many times is, well, you know, the students have to have X number of paragraphs. And the reality is that students, there is no set number. However, a student can't answer sufficiently a question such as this from this prompt in a paragraph. There's more that's needed, and that's part of the reason why students are not getting the kind of scores that they would like to get, you know, or that they expect they should get, is they're not creating that text. So, you know, I would expect as I'm working through this that I'm going to see, at a minimum, I'm going to see 3 paragraphs here, and I probably might see 4 because of how the student structures it. But I don't have a set amount. Again, it comes back to, can I answer the question and do what that question is asking me to do as I'm moving through. And, you know, Bonnie, I think the other thing that we have to keep in mind here as we go through is that it still comes back to the fact that our students have to do close reading, meaning they have to really dive into that the passage itself so that they're understanding what that passage says. They've got to unpack that prompt, and they've got to see the relationships in the text itself, because that's going to help them do the writing that they need to do. So, you know, we can't forget how important reading is to the writing process. They're so interconnected. Now, knowing you, you always have an acronym for something. So, and the orange pill says it all. Okay, I'm in North Carolina. We have apples. You have oranges. But anyway, as you go through, look at this acronym and think about how this really kind of sums it up for students. Pills. You've got to make a point. You've got to find that evidence to support that claim. You've got to explain it and show how it does that. And then you link it to the next point or from the last point. You've got to have some transitions in there. And last but not least, this is too about having a formal style. Not going at this from I, which so many of our students are used to doing, but keeping that formal style throughout, because that's going to make a difference too as they're looking at the total paper.
You know, Susan, as you said that, and we do want students to write in a formal style because that really is more effective for what we're doing. But please know that there was an urban myth that went out there that if a student used the word I a few times in the writing, he or she would automatically get a scorable 0. And that is not true. However, the higher the score, the more that you will see that formal writing concept. And as a teacher, I would want to teach students to basically stay away from the word I and use that more formal style of writing. But as they read through some of the sample writings, they may occasionally see the word I used, and those students still get points. Again, it continues to be on-demand draft writing. And because it's on-demand draft writing, yes, we still want them to revise or edit, but you may see a few errors. So the final step before they publish, before they send it in to be scored, is that what students must revise and edit. And when I hear the fact that our students are not using that 45 minutes or that 25 minutes, it says to me they are not going back, rereading, editing and revising their work. What should they look for? Susan and I developed a little editing and revision checklist in the guide that we'll show you in a moment But how we did it was we took the information from GED Testing Service. What are those big ideas they're looking for? What are some of the editing things they're looking for? And we put it together in a checklist. And so there again, we want students to make sure they take time. Make sure that they at least take those last 5 minutes to edit and to revise their work before they send it in, to read it to themselves so that, again, that's aha moment of that doesn't make sense. And although total spelling doesn't count, we want to make sure that sentences are crafted well and that those little errors in things such as to, or there, or verb tense matches, again, are fixed before it goes in. So that really ends up being our 6th step as we go through the 6 steps of effective argumentative writing. But as we look at that, we need to know that as we're implementing those steps in our classroom, first of all, once isn't enough. What we would recommend is you take each of those steps and you have students master before you scaffold or build onto them that next step. We want students to be able to identify each of those segments in other writing. In fact, research strongly supports that students learn how to write better by modeling their writing after effective writing. So use some of those writing samples. Can students identify the claims? Can they identify the evidence? Can they identify the counterclaim and rebuttals? As Susan said, there's no right way of where to place those things. Although the claim is generally the last sentence of the first paragraph, it may not be, and that's fine. Usually the counterclaim and rebuttal come towards the bottom of the body of the writing sample, but not always. It doesn't take away points. So students need to see that information and they need to be able to interact with different styles of writing so that they can see what they need to do. So as you think about your own classroom, we'd like you just to spend a few moments reflecting on what do your students need to be successful in creating argumentative writing samples that are going to get those points instead of those scorable zeros, and what each of us can do to improve our teaching of the writing process. If you've been with Susan and me throughout in some of the workshops, you know that we've dug a little deeper into some of these writings than we did initially when we were talking about argumentative writing. Why? Because you build those skills. As you see more things come from GED Testing Service, from some of our text, we know that to create this type of writer, you need to dig a little bit deeper. For any of you who have children or grandchildren currently in our K through 12 system, you've seen a number of things that those students have come home with as well that deal with argumentative writing. Because what I'm seeing is this style of writing is very much integral into late elementary, and why not? It is the writing of the real world. So, having said that, Susan, should we spend just a few moments, first of all, giving them one more time the GDTS thing, but then going to the workbook for a few moments?
Yeah, I think so. If you just, okay, thank you. You read my mind. For those of you who were asking source guides, well, there is your address, and the information is included in the guide on pages 18 and 19. As I said earlier, the newest edition of the materials includes scoring for social studies and for reasoning through language arts. It includes scoring for all 3 traits, but only the annotations for a specific trait. So in the first set, you'll see a lot of them scored in annotations on trait 1, but then as you move down at the very bottom under the annotations, it will say this received a score of something on trait 2 and something on trait 3. So please take advantage of those resources. It's a great way to kind of wrap your head around what's going on. Now, I'm going to go back to Jolene's question that came in about, I find it odd that they received nothing for trait 3. when I read that it is possible to get points even if they do not state a claim. And the issue here comes back to the fact that the student did not write enough original material for it to be scored. That is one of the reasons. Or if you, and especially this is true if you've been working with students on grammar, then they may know how to do certain things, but how to apply that into a real life situation is something different. But the majority of those cases is that a student will write 6 or 7 lines or sentences, and most of it is captured from the passage that they read as opposed to being their own original writing. Yesterday I had a chance to take part in a webinar, and they talked about this, and one of the issues, one of the questions that came up from people is, well, is the automated scoring engine not scoring things correctly? And the answer to that is that the automated scoring engine is scoring correctly. They have, at the request of different states, they have gone back in and taken a look and had human readers who go back, and they have them there on an ongoing basis. And so far, there have been absolutely no changes to what that original score was. In fact, in some cases, the human readers would have given that sample a lower score, but they don't lower a score after it's been awarded by the automated scoring engine. If it's going to be a higher score, then they would do that. So it really comes down to the fact that we have to make sure, go back to the two things once again, that our students are writing enough original material, their own words, and that they are answering the question. If we want to go back and make sure that our students are earning points as they're going through. Now, another question that came in, Bonnie, was whether or not these extended responses are being scored by an automated scoring engine or by humans. And so I think we reiterate one more time that an automated scoring engine scores all the responses with a couple caveats. If the scoring engine says, I've never seen this kind of thing before, somebody has written totally outside the box, that is ejected and is given to humans to read. A human reader actually will go through and analyze it. The other thing that human readers are doing is that they go in and they sporadically pull just random samples to make sure that it is on track. So that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind. They spent 6 months having every single one of the writing samples scored by the automated scoring engine and a human reader so that they could validate the effectiveness of the automated scoring engine itself. So you now have the website to pull those extended response resource guides, and you'll notice that Bonnie also has there one of the science ones listed as well. So you can come back and take a look at those as we're going through. And let's see, what's the total points students can earn on the social studies extended response? That is a question from Tanya Holder. The total number of points a student can earn on social studies, they can earn up to 2 points on trait 1, 1 point trait 2, 1 point trait 3, that's a total of 4. And then that is multiplied by 2 because it has a weighting factor to it. And as a result, they could earn up to 8 points. So 12 points they can earn on reasoning through language arts, 8 points on social studies. And then when it comes to science, we have 3 points for each of 2 short answers. So having said that, Bonnie, you want to go ahead and flip over? I think we've covered all of the questions here. So we can go over to the resource guide.
You should be seeing that now.
Okay, I'm not seeing it yet, so. I'm still seeing your PowerPoint.
Let's see whether we can get it up this way. Okay?
Nope, still not seeing it. So do you
Okay.
want to?
It has paused my screen
Okay.
sharing.
Then what I'm going to do is, if it's okay with you,
Will you pull it up? Yes.
I believe I can pull up. I can change presenters over to me. And at this point,
And while you're doing that, we'll talk a little bit. The guide that Susan's going to pull up for us is indeed the guide that all of you have available to you. It was sent to you when you signed or when you got the notice for here, but it's also out on Florida IP Day on the webinar site, and so all the information here is yours to use in the classroom. If there's something you want to adapt to your classroom, that's absolutely wonderful. But within this guide, the first couple pages deal with the classic argument style, and it just gives you some of that basic information.
hold on one second, and I'm having difficulty getting it to, there we go. Okay. Okay.
When you go ahead on, and Susan's scrolling as we talk, page 3, you have those beginning questions for close reading. And then you have a number of graphic organizers that we discussed. Like most of us, you won't use all of them, but you may find something that works very well for you and you say, that one is my favorite. So note that things like the V-chart and the pro-con are all the types of things that you can use to get students started in analyzing and evaluating an argument. You also have a few additional frames for your claims or thesis statements, as well as frames for incorporating evidence. As we've continued down this road of constructed response, the following organizer may look a little familiar to some of you. However, what we've done is changed it out a little bit because we now know that for more effective writing, we should include the claim and the rebuttal, and oftentimes students have more than one text. So all we did was change that out to add those different items. We, as Susan promised you, have a graphic organizer for that process of explaining the evidence. And then, because sentence structures really are helpful to our students, we've provided some different types of sentence starters and sentence frames. Everything from making connections or inferences to agreeing and disagreeing with ideas. And these come from a couple resources that we've given a course credit to, but it gives you an idea. On page 15, and we really didn't talk about this, but these are really good questions that students should ask themselves as they've written something, or if they're reading something someone else has written, can they answer those questions? And finally, the revising and editing checklist. I sure wouldn't give my students all of these things at one time, but it gives them an idea of what they should be looking for as they edit and revise. And finally, no workshop would be complete if we didn't provide you with a few resources from the World Wide Web. And just a couple you may want to take a look at, because many of us know Purdue's OWL, but there are a number of other sites out there. But before we go there, one of you had commented about Newsela, and it really is a great site for nonfiction articles along with the procon.org site. Both are wonderful. All it takes from you is drafting some type of a prompt using GDTS's style. But there again on page 19, Colorado State University has a great step-by-step guide that'll take you a little bit deeper into teaching argumentative writing. And of course, please don't forget to continually go back to Florida IP Day for additional lessons, plans, and all kinds of ideas, but keeping yourself informed from GD Testing Service as well as they create additional items.
And Bonnie, just a couple more things that we have in here, and I know it's 4 o'clock on the dot, so I'll keep it brief. But Sandra James, thank you so much for your comment. It is essential that students be given those opportunities to write throughout the ABE levels. So when they reach the 9.0, then they're really fine-tuning and crafting that college-ready, career and college-ready writing that will earn those top scores. But this entire process that we've gone through can be modified to work with ABE students. The thing is that the product will be different. You'll be working at a little different level and you won't go as intensely into this. But it is so important that students start evidence-based writing or argumentative writing early on in the ABE process. I have one other question. When they score a 0 on the response, does this mean they answered more of the questions? If they pass the test and they received a passing score and they still got a 0 on the extended response, that really is just referring to the fact that they earned no points there, but they had enough points off of the other pieces of the test in order to pass. So it still comes back to it's 20% no matter what. So that would be your answer at that point. And I believe, I think that we've got, that pretty much takes care of all of our different questions.
Sounds wonderful. We're going to leave you with one more quick idea before we close out for the day, and that is as you are starting to work with constructed response and argumentative style writing, make sure that you start with something of interest to students. We've had teachers who have used everything from using advertisements that show 2 different products and you have to take a stance of which one would be the best buy, to we all know that many of our students like sports, so we just went through the draft. Who should have been the first choice and why? Those are the kinds of things that you could do to get students started thinking about how constructed response works in their daily lives. And let's face it, we all use argumentative style discussions when we go for a job. Why am I the best choice? What evidence do I bring to an interview to show you that I'm a better choice than someone else? We need to keep it real. So, on behalf of Susan and myself and the IP Day team, we'd like to thank you for being with us today. If you have additional questions that you think of later, please contact us at Florida IP Day and we'll make sure to answer those. So, Susan, thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, everyone, and have a great evening and a great rest of the week.